I'm sure you're all aware of the cliched claim that boxing is 80% mental, 20% physical, or 85% mental, 15% physical, whatever arbitrary percentage you want to come up with. But it's really true, because there are many fighters out there who have tremendous physical ability, but they don't have the requisite mental constitution to make the most out of that physical ability when it counts, i.e. on fight night in the ring, under the bright lights, in front of all the fans, etc. Some guys just can't handle the pressure, the expectation from fans, family members, the media, and so on. Some guys are easily rattled by antics that their opponents might pull. Intimidation tactics, or maybe they get angry easily, they lose their cool easily, and it throws them off their game plan, and their opponent can take advantage of that. So the mental aspect is so important in boxing. This right here is a clip from a Manny Stewart interview that he did back in 2012, and it was part of this little mini documentary on the Sky Sports Boxing YouTube channel about Vladimir Klitschko. And Manny Stewart was talking about how important it is for a fighter to have the right mental constitution. And he said it's basically more important than the physical ability. Customado said something very similar. Mike Tyson himself had said something very similar. Manny Stewart basically implies that that's what he looks for first, is the right mental attitude in a fighter rather than the physical attributes. I strongly suspect that the reason Manny Stewart was so impressed with Tyson Fury and tipped him to become champion is not because he was being kind, since he was training Andy Lee, and Andy Lee is Tyson Fury's cousin. It's not because Tyson Fury is a big guy who could move a bit. Remember, this is a long time ago when Tyson Fury wasn't even half the fighter he is now. When Tyson Fury visited the Klitschko camp, I mean, this is the same Tyson Fury who struggled with John McDermott. This is the same Tyson Fury who was being ridiculed on a regular basis by most British boxing fans. I remember it well. Don't try to say it wasn't like that, because it was. He was being ridiculed regularly by most British boxing fans who saw him as a joke, who would constantly pass around gifs of him punching himself in the face. How can this guy become world champion? He punched himself in the face. This is what they were saying. So I don't think that Manny Stewart just looked at a big guy who could move a bit and thought, yeah, he's going to be champion. I strongly suspect that it was Tyson Fury's attitude, his confidence, the way he carried himself, his body language, which impressed Manny Stewart the most, because he must have seen hundreds of heavyweights in gyms over the years. But he wasn't tipping most of them to become heavyweight champions. I'm sure many of them had great ability. But with Tyson Fury, he saw something. He saw something in his eyes, saw something about his attitude, and he was like, he's got it. When Tyson Fury came back from the Klitschko camp, I remember this. He did an interview, and he was asked whether he was impressed by what he saw over there. And Tyson Fury said, I wasn't impressed at all, to be honest. I went over there and I just saw a guy in a gym with some gloves on hitting a bag. He's just another bare bum in the shower. Now that attracted a tremendous amount of ridicule from British boxing fans. How can you say this when you punch yourself in the face? And, you know, all the usual stuff they used to say back then. But I was very impressed by Fury's attitude. That's the attitude I want to hear when you go over to a rival's training camp. And I use the word rival very pointedly, because that's how Tyson Fury saw Klitschko. He didn't see him as someone that he needed to look up to or even learn from. He just saw him as someone who one day is, you know, probably going to be a rival of his. He's going to step in the ring and fight this guy. So he wasn't impressed. And that impressed me. I don't want to hear a heavyweight come back from the champ's training camp sounding like a fan, or any fighter of any weight for that matter. So Fury's attitude impressed me. I strongly suspect that it impressed Manny Stewart as well. Now, I didn't know Fury was going to go on to be a champion at that time, but I certainly liked his attitude with regards to the Klitschko training camp. Now, when Anthony Joshua went to Klitschko's training camp, I think that was to help Klitschko prepare for Pulev. Correct me if I'm wrong. He did an interview afterwards where he said that he essentially implied that he held back in sparring because he didn't want to disrespect the champ. Now, I didn't like hearing that from Anthony Joshua. Joshua and Klitschko got along very well in training camp. That's why they're still cool now, because of all the respect that AJ showed him in that camp. And he looked up to Klitschko. He tried to learn a lot from him. He even called him big bro, and, Klitschko was calling him little bro. And I think that attitude and that dynamic between the two carried over into their fight, where AJ didn't really impose himself on Klitschko in the pre-fight build-up the way that Tyson Fury imposed himself on Klitschko. And even though Anthony Joshua went on to win, he stopped Klitschko. Tyson Fury didn't manage to do that. And obviously it was earlier in Joshua's career when he fought Klitschko, as opposed to Tyson Fury, who was a bit more experienced at the time when he fought him. But Tyson Fury, of course, did fight him on away soil. In the ring, Anthony Joshua was not as confident against Klitschko as Tyson Fury was. You're lying to yourself if you try and say otherwise. Go and look at Tyson Fury when he's in the ring against Klitschko. Look at his body language, the way he's moving around, the look in his eyes. He's way more confident than AJ was. AJ, he was confident to a certain degree, of course, but there are levels of confidence. And AJ's a very confident guy. He's a very mentally strong guy. Don't misconstrue what I'm saying here. But there are levels of confidence and there are levels of mental strength. And Tyson Fury, as confident as AJ is just a bit more naturally confident. So, anyway, Manny Stewart knows a bit about psychology. You have to be, I think, does he say that in this interview? It's either him or somebody else. I think it's him who says you basically have to be, and even Mike Tyson said this too, to be a good boxing trainer, you have to be a good psychologist, a good psychiatrist. You have to know the fighter's mind and what they need psychologically to get the best out of them. You have to know what motivates them, what frightens them, so on. Now, this is an interview which I've referenced before. And there was also another interview which was in one of the boxing publications at the time, either Ring Magazine, KO Magazine, Boxing Monthly, Boxing Illustrated, one of them. And Manny Stewart was talking about what it was like training Evander Holyfield for the Riddick Bowe rematch. Holyfield had lost to Riddick Bowe. He lost his undisputed title. Riddick Bowe was seen as the next best thing. Holyfield was written off by most going into the rematch. In training camp for the fight, Manny Stewart said that Holyfield talked more about Mike Tyson than he did about Riddick Bowe. And he was actually concerned about that. He had to pull him to the side a few times and say, Evander, you're not training for Tyson. Tyson's in prison. We don't even know if he's ever going to fight again. You need to get your mind on the job. You're fighting Riddick Bowe. Paul Dempsey, the interviewer here, tries to make quite a big deal about Holyfield being a devout Christian, suggesting that that's where Holyfield gets most of his inspiration from to fight. Manny Stewart kind of dismisses that and says, no, the main thing about Holyfield is he is one of the most egotistical fighters I've ever trained in my life. And he was very upset. His ego was very hurt by the fact that the boxing media and the public was still talking more about Mike Tyson than they were talking about him. It was his ego that drove him. Now, somebody who's as fiercely egotistical as that, and it's very deceptive with Holyfield because he comes across as very humble and stuff like that in public, but behind closed doors in the gym, extremely egotistical. That's what Manny Stewart emphasizes in this interview. Now, in a social context, somebody who's fiercely egotistical like that, it can become a problem. But in boxing, however you find your motivation, however you find the energy to drive you, to make you better, it's all good. Okay. And in this case, it was Holyfield's ego. It was the envy that he felt towards Mike Tyson, because Tyson was getting far more accolades and Holyfield felt like he deserved just as many accolades. Going into the Mike Tyson fight in '96, when he eventually faced off, Holyfield essentially had been preparing for Mike Tyson for many years. Mike Tyson, on the other hand, was taking this Holyfield fight, believing that Holyfield was done. He was washed up. His promoter, Don King, according to Manny Stewart, told him that he thought Holyfield was washed up, because Manny Stewart says he advised Don King against putting Tyson in with Holyfield. He said, Holyfield's obsessed with Tyson. You don't understand, Don. He's obsessed with the guy. Anyway, this is Mike Tyson staring Evander Holyfield down in the ring before their first fight started. And he was also staring him down at the weigh-in. Staring people down was Mike Tyson's thing. You see, some fighters don't care about the stare down. I remember Odlinair Solis, the Cuban heavyweight. He would always look at the floor during the referee's instructions. He never cared about staring the opponent down. Mike Tyson always stared opponents down when he was champion, when he was at the top. He always would do it. It was his thing. He wanted to try and intimidate the opponent. He talked about, if the opponent looked away, I knew then that I got him psychologically. So this is him before the first fight, typical Tyson. He gets defeated in this fight. He gets stopped. And in fact, there are moments in this fight where Mike Tyson tries to quit. I know Mike Tyson fanboys are going to get upset by that, but it's true. And Teddy Atlas predicted it, by the way. I remember at the time Teddy Atlas predicted it. In the second fight, he predicted it. Or in the run-up to the second fight. There's a round in this fight where Mike Tyson actually headbutts Holyfield. He clearly goes forward and shoves his head into Holyfield's to try and headbutt him. The commentators disgracefully don't pick up on what is an obvious headbutt. And people always talk about Holyfield headbutting Tyson. There is a moment in this fight where Tyson literally launches his head into Holyfield's head. And it's blatantly obvious that Tyson was trying to worsen the cut on his own eye, because Tyson got cut in the fight. He was trying to worsen the cut in his own eye because he wanted out. Now, why did he want out? Yeah, Holyfield was beating the brakes off him, but Tyson took a tremendous shellacking in the Buster Douglas fight, and he took it like a man. But that's when Mike Tyson still believed in his own invincibility. You know, he probably thought in the back of his mind somewhere, as bad a beating as he was taking against Douglas, I'm still going to get him. I am Mike Tyson. Something's going to happen and I'm still going to get him. And he nearly did get him in the 8th round. But ultimately, he got knocked out badly. Now, fast forward 6 years to when he fought Holyfield. Once he started getting beaten, the ghosts of the Buster Douglas fight came flooding back. He started feeling the same way that he felt in that Douglas fight. And he didn't want to go there again. And that's why he headbutted Holyfield in that particular round, trying to worsen the cut on his own eye and hopefully get it stopped. This is why he did that. The moment that he did it in this particular video, Ferdy Pacheco says Tyson got hit with a head, or, you know, there was a clash of heads and Tyson actually got hurt from a head. But it wasn't a clash of heads. It was Tyson headbutting Holyfield in that instance. Now, in the rematch, after Mike Tyson gets stopped here in 11 rounds and takes another shellacking, similar to the Buster Douglas shellacking, all of a sudden, before the fight, Tyson's not staring his opponent down anymore. And again, this is out of character for Mike Tyson. This is not a guy who doesn't care about stare downs. This is a guy who makes a big deal of staring his opponent down. So this is him looking at Holyfield before the first fight. Compare that to how he was for the second fight. Look at Mike Tyson's eyes, people. That's his eyes looking at Holyfield before the first fight. And that's his eyes during the stare down of the second fight. Holyfield's eyes are up here. Tyson's not looking at his eyes. This is a troubled man. The demons from the first fight and the Buster Douglas fight were weighing on Mike Tyson's mind. This is in 1997. And since we're on the topic of psychology, this is something which is predicated on psychology. Well, actually, the manipulation of psychology. That's right, propaganda. This book was written in the 1920s by a man named Edward Bernays. Bernays was the nephew of the famous psychologist Sigmund Freud. And he was also Freud's disciple. He learned a lot from his uncle. And he applied that to his own career, where he was employed by the American government, various corporations, public figures, and so on, to run propaganda campaigns for them. He used his knowledge of human psychology to manipulate the public into buying things that they don't need, supporting things which they previously opposed, and in many cases misleading them, making them believe things that were not true. He talks about it all in this book. In fact, do you mind if I read you a little sample of this book, just to give you a flavor of the kind of thing you can expect if you read it? This is from chapter 1, Organizing Chaos. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. It remains a fact that in almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness old forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world. So that's just a little excerpt from that book, which, if you're interested in psychology, if you're interested in propaganda, and believe you me, 2020 has been probably one of the most prolific years for propaganda in human history. The vast majority of people, of course, fall for propaganda. That's why they still use it. Most people are incapable of seeing through propaganda. They always believe that it's someone else who's going to fall for it in a different country or during a different time. But when it actually appears in front of their own eyes, they fall for it. It's quite extraordinary. But this book, Propaganda by Edward Bernays, will explain some of the methods used to manipulate people into believing things that are not true, buying things they don't need, supporting things they previously opposed, and so on. But it also gives an insight into the human condition and why people are so susceptible to propaganda. And again, don't for 1 second think that in 2020, in Britain and all over the world, that people are any less susceptible to propaganda now than they were back in the 1940s. If anything, they're even more susceptible to it. And anyone with eyes to see and ears to hear will know that that is absolutely the fact in 2020. If only it wasn't. So, boxers like Mike Tyson are mentally tougher than the average civilian, of course. Mentally tougher than the average boxer. But they're still human beings. When they suffer humiliating defeats, people thinking that they can just get over it and not be haunted by ghosts in their subconscious are either people that have no experience with boxing, and that's the case 99.9% of the time, because they are totally unrealistic. Mike Tyson, even though he was a tremendous and fearsome fighter, he's not a machine, he's a human being. Okay? And hence why you see these eyes for the first Holyfield fight and these eyes for the second Holyfield fight. Now, even Lennox Lewis, I've talked about following the Oliver McCall fight, the first one. He was gun shy for a long time. It took several years for him to get his mojo back. But as the saying goes, sometimes anyway, what doesn't kill you only makes you stronger. I actually prefer the saying from The Dark Knight, where the Joker says, what doesn't kill you simply makes you stranger. I think that's probably more accurate. But sometimes it makes you stronger. And in the case of Lennox Lewis, it made him stronger. That Oliver McCall defeat made Lewis so much more mentally strong, not just the defeat, but the way he came back from it. Because when he got knocked out by Hasim Rahman in South Africa, he had an immediate rematch and he wasn't gun shy at all. You see, he came back from the Oliver McCall defeat and he was gun shy against journeyman. But the next time he got knocked out, he'd been through that experience before and he knew what it took to rebuild himself mentally. Even his trainer, Manny Stewart, was surprised by how confident Lennox was in the build-up to the Rahman rematch. You see, that really made him, was the experience of the Oliver McCall defeat and rebuilding himself. So the next time he got knocked out, it was easy for him to come back from it. Now, most fighters are not like that. Most fighters, the second time they get knocked out, it can be even more traumatic than the first time. It can push their confidence to an all-time low the second time they get knocked out or the third time they get knocked out. But Lennox Lewis was made of sterner stuff than most fighters, so it actually made him stronger. Lennox Lewis was a tremendously strong man mentally. Now, how this all relates, of course, again, bringing it back to Anthony Joshua. So I made those two videos where I said that Anthony Joshua is still living with the ghosts of Andy Ruiz in the back of his mind. And that was clear from the way he performed against Pulev. Not that it was a bad performance. It wasn't a bad performance. I said in my post-fight video, it was a good performance overall. But it was so obvious to me from Anthony Joshua's body language, from the way he fought, from the look in his eyes, that Ruiz defeat in New York is still haunting him. And several people in boxing, independent of me, I didn't hear them say this when I made my post-fight video, and I'm sure they didn't hear my post-fight video when they made their comments. But several people in boxing have said the same thing as me, that they looked at that Kubrat Pulev fight and they said Anthony Joshua still hasn't recovered from Andy Ruiz. Dylan White said it. Dean White said it. Ben Davison said it. And I know you're going to instantly react by saying, well, those are all rivals of Anthony Joshua. You know, Dylan White and Dean, obviously they're not going to have too many compliments for him. And Ben Davison's just a Tyson Fury fanboy, so why would he be complimentary of AJ? Okay, fair enough. But Teddy Atlas don't have a horse in the race. And in this Teddy Atlas podcast, he says that based upon what he saw there against Kubrat Pulev, Anthony Joshua still has ghosts from the Andy Ruiz fight in New York living in his attic. Right, the attic, I guess, is the mind, the subconscious. He still has ghosts of the Andy Ruiz fight living in his attic. And he's done a heck of a job closing the windows and, you know, trying to keep some ghosts out. But there are still some ghosts up there And Teddy Atlas is a guy who understands psychology, especially the psychology of fighters. And I'm sure some of it is going to come from his own experience in life. Some of it is going to come from Customado and so on. And some of it, his experience with fighters. And he looked at the AJ Pulev fight and he saw the exact same things as me. Right? Two completely independent people from each other. And we saw the same thing. This is not to try and diminish AJ. This is not to try and bash AJ. It's just an objective observation. That's all it is. And it's an objective observation in the context of Anthony Joshua looking to fight Tyson Fury next. Ideally, you'd want AJ to put in a more confident performance going into the Tyson Fury fight. It wasn't a bad performance against Pulev, but you can still see that he's not quite 100% in terms of his confidence again yet. And it's not just me that's noticed this, people. Lots of others have noticed it. Lots of very knowledgeable people and experienced people in the boxing game. Now, as much as Teddy Atlas understands psychology very well, especially the psychology of fighters, I don't think he necessarily applies psychology that well. He's very good when it comes to the theory, but when it comes to the practical, I'm not so sure. I think that people like Adam Booth actually apply psychology practically a bit better than Teddy Atlas. Now, that's not to say that Teddy Atlas's approach to training fighters and the way he prepares them mentally is going to be wrong for every fighter. No, for some fighters, it's going to be absolutely perfect. But for other fighters, the drill sergeant approach, and Teddy Atlas, by his own admission on his podcast, he's basically said that's how he is in the gym. He's like a drill sergeant, like an army sergeant. That approach is not going to work for some fighters. For a lot of fighters, it's not going to work for them. I mean, you look at Ishmael Salas, for example, the way he is with Joe Joyce, he brings fun into the gym. He tries to lift the mood and he's playing the Cuban music and it's all very effervescent and uplifting in there. With Teddy Atlas, it's more like strictness and all this kind of business. So different strokes for different folks. And a trainer who is versatile in their psychological approach is more advanced than a trainer who has this one-size-fits-all attitude, which is kind of what Teddy Atlas seems to have in terms of how he tries to train his fighters psychologically. He has this kind of one-size-fits-all attitude. So, yeah, he understands fighters very well psychologically, but in terms of the way he tries to condition them psychologically, the methods he uses are not appropriate for a lot of fighters. This is the reason that Shannon Briggs fell out with Teddy Atlas. This is the reason that Michael Moorer fell out with Teddy Atlas. They spoke about this publicly. You see, and again, I'm not having a go at Teddy. Teddy's got tremendous knowledge of boxing. I like listening to his podcast. I like his analogies and all that kind of stuff in the attic and the bread baskets. And I like all that stuff. But understand, because the reason I'm saying this is because there was somebody on one of my videos a few weeks back saying, you don't give Teddy Atlas any credit, or you don't give him enough credit. It's not about not giving Teddy Atlas enough credit. I give him plenty of credit. It's about being objective. We all have strengths and weaknesses as human beings. I'm not one of these people who will look at a trainer or anybody and say, oh, he's amazing, it's incredible, oh God, there's just not even a flaw in anything that he does. It's just perfect. Everything he says is gospel. A lot of people are like that, as I mentioned in previous videos. They have this innate desire to hero worship. I don't have the innate desire to hero worship. It's what makes people like me different. I don't have that in me. Okay? So I tend to look at people more realistically and objectively, where I have tremendous respect for Teddy and what he's done and, what have you. But I don't deify the man. I look at the plus and the negative, right? The positives and the negatives, the pluses and the minuses. because we all have them. Me, you, everybody. Anyway, let me end this here. It was just a video I wanted to make about boxing psychology, expanding a little bit on the previous videos I made about Anthony Joshua in a more general kind of way, to try and explain that this is not about being a fanboy. Because for a lot of boxing fans, that's all it's about. Supporting this fighter or supporting that fighter and, you know, the fanboy thing. For me, it's not about that. I look at boxing in a more clinical way. And yes, there are fighters I prefer over other fighters, of course. But when I'm assessing their ability and when I'm assessing their performances, I'm assessing them from an objective, analytical perspective. It's not me projecting what I want in the fighter, even when it's not there. I want to believe that it was a perfect performance from AJ and he didn't put a foot wrong and he looked outstanding and there was no weaknesses. So I'm going to assess the fight that way with that preconceived perception. No. Sorry, folks. You might operate that way. I don't operate that way. I think Anthony Joshua has been tremendous for boxing. He's a very exciting fighter. He's achieved so much in a short space of time. Okay? But he has weaknesses just like everybody does. And my whole thing is the weaknesses showed themselves in that Pulev fight, the mental weaknesses as well as some technical flaws. These are things that Tyson Fury is going to be looking to exploit. That's all my point was. And Anthony Joshua, it will be nice to see Anthony Joshua completely mentally recovered from the Andy Ruiz fight before he fights the Gypsy King. So that's what I was looking for in the book. I was hoping that he would, you know, surprise me and be totally over that Ruiz fight and show no residual psychological issues from it at all. But that wasn't the case. So I'm not going to ignore it. I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to acknowledge it. It is what it is. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I'm out. If you'd like to access all my boxing content advert-free and enjoy the convenience of listening via a podcast app with the option to download in high-quality MP3, then consider joining me on Patreon. In addition to the aforementioned perks, you'll also gain access to exclusive weekly live stream Q&A sessions and hangouts, as well as uncensored, no-holds-barred uploads which are too blue for YouTube. This includes my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. Just head on over to my Patreon page and select the tier called Hatman Boxing Extra. There's no contract, there's no commitment, it's only £2.50 a month and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of hardcore boxing enthusiasts by signing up with me here on Patreon today.